Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the RUCKCast. My name's Jim Palmer. I'm your host. Today I want to talk about something that's a little nerdy, and it's also kind of on topic. I've seen some conversations just yesterday about this exact topic, and so I wanted to spend a little bit of time going over it, mainly because I was already going to talk about it, as you'll see here in a minute. And if you're paying attention and you're looking on YouTube and watching the video, you already know that today I want to talk about minimum basic rates, or MBR. It's kind of an interesting topic because we don't really talk about it too much. And everybody just kind of goes, oh, well, this is the minimum basic rate. And so we're just going to kind of leave it, just let it run whatever the default is. We're going to leave it alone and just kind of go with it. But I want to talk about it because there's something else interesting that's going on here. At least it's interesting to me. Maybe it's interesting to you. And I want to start with when you first sit down and start talking about a network. You sit down and you go, okay, I want to design a network. You get your floor plans, you get all your stuff, and then you set your criteria. And one of the first criteria we really talk about and we set to is what is going to be my coverage? What is my signal level that I want to design to? Now, I can tell you there's some other trains of thought about this, but one of the things that you end up setting in your design tool, whatever design tool you use, is you set a minimum signal coverage. What is my minimum? What is my RSSI value that I'd like to get to? Now, most people will set like a minus 65 dBm. Sometimes it'll be minus 67, depending. But you set that in your design tool, right? And so you go ahead and you set that up. You set up, you go, hey, I want my channels to be 20 megahertz wide, 40 megahertz wide, maybe 80 megahertz wide if you're in 6 gigahertz. And you go through and you do all your design and you validate it and you go, look how pretty my design looks. I'm meeting all these criterias for, how many APs are on a channel, what my minimum signal level is, what my data rate is. And if you do it right, you're looking at, at least a minus 67 across most of the map. And, at anywhere from a 20 to a 40 megahertz wide channel, you're going to get easily above 100 megabits per second. And so, when you look at the MCS charts on mcsindex.org or .net, and you see like, oh yeah, I'm going to set it at here. And so cool. You get it approved, you go deploy it, everything hits, you get it on the controller, you go back and you look, okay, what are my channel bandwidths? What are my, and then you do a validation survey and you do all this stuff and everybody's like, yeah, cool. It's all said and done. But the one thing you never said is the MBR. You just go, we're just going to leave that alone. We're going to leave it at whatever the vendor default is. And most vendor defaults in 2.4 gigahertz is 1. And in 5 gigahertz, it's 6. Turns out that in 6 gigahertz, it's also 6. And so you set that. But have you ever gone to look in the MCS chart, mcsindex.net, to see, well, what's required to get to that? I have. And I'll tell you. With 2 spatial streams and a 20 megahertz wide channel, in order to get to 6 megabits per second, it's an MCS of 0. Same thing on 2.4, MCS of 1, or to get them 1 megabit per second data rate, you need an MCS of 0. But think about what you designed. You designed for all this fantastic coverage where you're getting 100 megabits per second, but then you don't change that one thing, and you go, oh well, because I might have a device that can only do 6 megabits per second or 1 megabit per second. But what does that cost you? And today I want to spend a few minutes and go through and figure out what does that actually cost you. So let's talk about what that is. So beacon and management frames transmit at the lowest configured basic rate and the highest transmit power. Now, there's some other frames that go out at the lowest rate, period. So you can't get off of those. So when you do a PCAP and you look, even if you have your minimum basic rate set to something higher, you're still going to see some frames that go out at the lowest. So it's going to be 1 or 6, depending on the band you're looking at. And we can't adjust those. That's in the standard, and they will always go out at that. But beacon frames and other management frames like probe requests will go out at the minimum basic rate that you configure. And so if you think about it, if you set something to, if you leave it at, and we're just going to focus on 5 gigahertz and that 6 megabits per second here for a second. And if you leave it at that, it's going to go out, every 102.4 milliseconds, you're going to send out a beacon frame, and that beacon frame's going out at 6 megabits per second. Now, the beacon frame contains a whole bunch of data, right? It has all the data that you need to run the network, to advertise what the network is, what devices need to support, all the other little fun bits and bobs, the type of security, everything else that you configure, all those little nerd knobs get advertised in the beacon frame. So depending on how many nerd knobs you turn on, and if you watched my video on the Ruckus TX VAP and the multi-BSSID, the more of those little nerd knobs you turn on, the more data you have to send out in that beacon frame. Well, if you're sending it at the lowest possible data rate on the entire, band, it's going to take longer to send it out because it's sending it at a lower MCS rate, right? So you take extra time to do that. But if you were to change that MBR from, say, a 6 to a 12 or to a 24, you're going to send it out at either twice the speed or 4 times the speed, which means that instead of me taking 6 minutes to get to this point, if I was talking 4 times as fast, then I would have gotten to this point at less than 2 minutes. And that's the same thing, right? So people who like to turn on podcasts or turn on YouTube videos and watch them at like 1.25 speed because they can get through them faster, same concept. Except we're sending out these management frames at the lowest speed. And so the problem you have is if you end up with a bare minimum of 3 SSIDs, right? And again, if you go back and you watch, my multi-BSSID video, we talk about that, right? It takes extra time on a channel, transmit opportunities, stuff like that. Now in 2.4 and 5 gigahertz, we're not using multi-BSSIDs and non-transmitted BSSID information. So we need to be very quick at getting on and off. And when we set something to 6 or even 12, what we're saying is, hey, we still want to talk slower, even though we designed our entire network to go out, and achieve 100 megabits per second. And then we go, yeah, but cool, those 6 megabits per second clients, we want those to come on in too, because, we might need to support those. And it just seems backwards to me, right? We design these really awesome networks to do all this really cool stuff and meets all these other criteria and all these other guidelines. And then we go ahead and we just jam it up by putting in a rate limiter on the channel that says, hey, 10 times a second, I'm going to come in, and when everybody else is talking at 100 megabits per second, 200 megabits per second, MCS 8, MCS 9, those really high MCS rates because we designed a really good network. And then every 102.4 milliseconds, you have a beacon that comes in and goes, okay, now that you guys are, talking really good, I'm going to slow down and I'm going to tell you about this network that you're connected to. Same thing with probe requests. So the other thing, broadcast and multicast data, that goes at the lowest basic rate, the MBR. Probe responses, MBR. AX and CTS, they'll go to, those are different. They'll go at a different rate. But what you'll also see is the probe requests from unassociated clients. Those will go in at the lowest possible rate because it doesn't know. It doesn't know any better. And so when you go in and you have a brand new client device, and it says, hey, I want to connect. So I'm going to do a probe request. I'm not connecting anything. I'm doing a broadcast probe request. Hey, what's out there? And your AP sends a probe response as 6 megabits per second. Then the client goes, okay, cool. We're talking at 6 megabits per second, even though you designed the whole thing to do 100. It's just kind of, sort of a contradiction in my mind, because we shouldn't be doing that stuff, right? And so when you set up all your design tools and you have it to do all these things, and then you forget this one little step in your configuration tool. We get channels, we get, transmit power values. We get all this configuration information from our design tools. But have you ever put in a minimum basic rate in a design tool? You haven't, because it's not there. And so we just, because it's like, oh, it's not anything we do, we're just going to leave the defaults. And that becomes a problem. Now, we're going to get to that here in a second, why that's a problem. But before I do, I want to talk about one of the biggest arguments against doing something like that, or something like this. And that is because people will talk about the cell size. And they'll say, hey, we want to increase our minimum basic rates, our MBRs, because we want to shrink the cell size. Well, but here's the thing. Like I said, when you do the design, you've already designed it to be able to hit 100 megabits per second in your sale. So why are you setting it at 6? Because what happens is you now have an AP that's broadcasting at 6. Now, remember, it's going out at the highest transmit power. And so it's spreading it out. And so the problem you have is when you do your designs and you design less than max power, what happens is you look at your co-channel interference and you go, hey, I'm good. I don't have that co-channel interference, co-channel contention. That's kind of an interesting conversation I'm seeing. I want to see where it goes in the next year or so, is between co-channel contention and co-channel interference. But what we're talking about is having two APs on the same channel, right? Because if you design for a very low transmit power, then you're not going to see the co-channel contention and co-channel interference in your design tool, because it's not looking at that minimum basic rate. But if you got to remember, if it's going out at the minimum basic rate of 6 and the highest transmit power, it's actually going to increase the cell size. So when I say, hey, I think you got to turn those things up, and I'll cover that sort of at the end. That's my little teaser for you. When you get to that point, and you say, well, I might shrink my cell size. Well, yeah, but your cell size is already shrunk from your design when you said, hey, I'm going to transmit at less power and I'm going to get to 100 megabits per second. So why stick that at? Now, when I'm talking about, APs hearing each other, there's actually two different things within the 802.11 standard that we have to pay attention to. And one is signal detect, and the other one is energy detect. And they have different parameters, and they're looking for different things, right? Now, and I wrote this down so I wouldn't get it wrong. So let me read it. So the signal detect is something for close neighbors, but that is that value is usually about a neg 82. And what happens is if an AP can decode the preamble and read the duration in NAD field, and it will defer for the stated frame duration. Now, a frame at 6 megabits per second has a longer duration. Remember, we were talking about going slower and faster, but it has a frame at 6 megabits per second has a longer duration than the same frame at 24 megabits per second. The highest we can go on Ruckus. So it's the same data, but you end up with a longer deferral. So you're slowing down an AP that you never thought you had interference or contention problems with, because you designed for a smaller cell. But by setting it at a 6, leaving it at default, it gets bigger. And so you can actually impede more. Now, the other one is an energy detect. An energy detect is a minus 62. Now, they can't decode the frame at all. They just see the RF energy and they defer as long as it's above and that. But the longer frame, same thing, right? It's a longer time on the channel. So you get more deferrals. And so it's not just on your one cell, on that one, BSS ID. It's across all of it. So by raising that thing up, you're reducing the amount of time, which means that even if you have, some co-channel contention or co-channel interference, you end up having those, you're decreasing that by raising your minimum brace, as opposed to leaving them, further down. Now, what happens when we leave them at the default? And I want to go and I want to show you something that I just collected a little while ago. And this is some PCAPs I collected in the field. And I took the PCAPs and I dumped it into Wi-Fi Explorer Pro. And I said, hey, show me what we see. And what you'll see here on channel 1, we have one overlapping channel, 2.4 gigahertz. The beacon overhead is 132%. Come down to channel 6, it's 164%. Come down here to channel 11, 160%. We have 58 networks, 60 networks at 2.4 gigahertz. And if you come over here and you look at these minimum rates, look at what these minimum rates are. 1 megabit per second and 6 megabits per second. And look at these times. You're looking at 2.6 milliseconds, down to a half a millisecond. Now these are not, there's none of these are multi-BSSIDs. These are all of those really high, just really low data rates, which ends up causing you more beacon airtime. So when we talk about that time, like, hey, how long does it detect? What's the duration of that frame on the channel? That's what I'm talking about, is it's driving that up. And when you have multiple networks, because, you're still running one SSID per VLAN, now you end up where you have that many channels, that many networks on these channels, and it's not good, and here's the thing is when I found all this stuff, it wasn't a one-time thing. 69%, 98%, 51%, same thing, 6 megabits per second, 1 megabit per second. And look at these really long durations. So all of these really long durations that we see, right, are just really kind of messing it up. And even when we come over here and you look, channel 11, and what we're looking at here is the channel and the number of networks. It only has 22 networks on it, which for 2.4 is actually not too bad, but it's still 51%. Now, nobody was on these networks when I took these readings, so there weren't any stations. And so what we're looking at here is just the beacon overhead. This is just exactly how much time it takes on the channel. And so when you look at a 1 megabit per second data rate, and here's the other little kicker, 1 megabit per second minimum basic rate on 2.4 gigahertz, that is not OFDM rate. That is a DSSS rate. So this is 802.11b. So they've still enabled 802.11b on these networks. And then they go, hey, Jim, why is my network not working well? Well, I'll tell you why. It doesn't take much. It takes a laptop with, Wi-Fi Explorer Pro, and you get stuff that looks like this. Here's another one, 134, 155. 155% of the time is spent on nothing but beacons. When does the data get through? Anybody? I feel like, Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Bueller, when's that data get through? Take a look at another one, 95, 74%, 98%. I mean, and then you even take a look at this channel 64 right here that has 24 networks at 5 gigahertz. 14% of the time is on nothing but beacons. Can you, and what happens is when you get, it's not up to 100% when things start to fall apart. Things start to fall apart sooner than 100%. Because Wi-Fi still needs that management overhead. And if the management overhead can't function, then the BSSID starts to fall apart. The channel starts to fall apart. So we're not trying to compare, because I'll tell you, even at 95 and 98%, those are that's just dysfunctional. It won't work. And this is with no clients. And all we're looking at here is the beacons anyway. So the channel utilization is just maxed out, but there's no clients. Right? Let's take a look at another one. This one's a little bit better. Take a look at those. This one, we ended up with some adjacent channel interference at 2.4. If you've never seen that, let's take a look at that. You got channel 8 and channel 10. There's one network on each one. And so the overlap, oh look, 74 networks are overlapping on that one channel. And so you still end up with a 1% on that channel, but you're basically combining the 104 and the 77. And that's just not something that functions and works in real time. Even when you come down here and you take a look at some of these other ones that are cleaner down here, down in the Uni 2, you still 14%, 13% beacon overhead. This is what these low minimum basic rates and this extended beacon airtime. Oh, we got one that's down to 0.4, right? That's what kills you, right? Now, one more. This was the best one that I found, but it's still, I mean, look at this, 0.5, 0.5, 2.6, 2.7, 50%, only 50% of my time is beacons. All right. And that's the best. This is why we don't move this stuff, right? So let me reference this to something where we've raised the MBR. We put it up on the high one. And what you can see here is we're going to start over here on this side, and we're going to take a look at the minimum basic rate of 24 megabits per second. And this is on 2.4. The 20 megahertz, you can see, these are the max rates, right? So you got 20 megahertz, we got 160 megahertz. If we come over and look, that's a 6, but look at that. 0 milliseconds, that's a multi-BSSID. So this is 6 gigahertz. So I'm running some 160 megahertz channels and 6 gigahertz. Look at these 80 megahertz right here. Come across 24, 0.18 compared to 0.4. The only one of these rates that's above a 0.1 is that one that's carrying 2 to 3 different SSIDs, because it's a multi-BSSID, and it's still running half the amount of time. And it's at 6 megabits per second. And we're still going half the time, because it's all about the time. Time is the one thing that I can't get back. I can't get back time. Once that time's gone, the time is gone, right? So this is really what I'm pushing for when I talk about, the minimum problem is people look at it and they go, hey, we can't, we don't want to raise that because we're afraid. Well, what are you afraid of, right? What is it that you are afraid of? So let's talk about that for a minute. IoT devices. Are there IoT devices out there that, can't do 24 megabits per second? Maybe. I'm not going to say there's not, because there's a bajillion IoT devices. But are they on your network? If they're not, why are you designing and preparing for something that's not on your network? You're dragging down your entire network and making it slow and making it inefficient, just simply because you're afraid of a device that may come along, right? I call that the possible versus probable. And so what I would tell you to do is set your minimum basic rates higher, right? Because if you've designed your network correctly, if you've validated your network and you've looked at it and you go, we're meeting all of our other criteria, and then you go ahead and you set those minimum basic rates at the vendor defaults. And look, I work for a vendor. I get it. And the reason why they're there is because we got to set it. Something has to be the default. There's got to be we can't not have a minimum basic rate, right? Now, so they're there. They're there for a reason. But what I'm telling you is raise those rates up, because it's, like I said, you might have a device that comes along, and you know what? If that happens, you go, okay, let's deal with your device that's obviously from, either so cheap that it doesn't support, anything recent, or, why does it all of a sudden become our fault when somebody else buys a really terrible device? We have to deal with it. We have to fix it. I get that, right? I totally get that. But why are we letting it drag down our entire network for the thousands of other devices on it? Because we might find an IoT device that's not good enough. And you know what? If that's the case, then you put that damn thing on 2.4, right? You change your minimum basic rate. Don't ever turn on 11B. Don't let me hear you. If I hear about that, I'll come find you. I know who you are. Don't do it. But, even 11G, 11N, 11N came out in 2009. Is 16 years, you think you can get something newer than 11N in 16 years? Yeah, you probably can, right? And if you have to set a lower minimum rate, set it to 12 and then go down to 6, right? But don't kneecap your network because somebody might have a device that might pop up, that might be that one corner case. It's possible, yes, but is it probable? Probably not. So don't do it, right? No one's going to say, hey, when you raise the minimum basic rates from 6 to 24, all my clients lost connectivity. That's not going to happen because you want them doing 100 megabits per second anyway. You've designed your network to do 100 megabits per second. So if that happened, there's a problem, and it's not with the configurations. There is a problem somewhere else. So go solve that problem and don't kneecap the other, go solve that corner case problem and let the rest of your network run and breathe freely. Because a device that's connected to your network at 6 megabits per second, do you really want that device on your network? Because remember, you're talking about an MCS of 0. And when I say turn it up to 24, you're looking at an MCS of 1. I mean, is that such a high bar? All I'm literally asking you to do is go from an MCS of 0 to an MCS of 1 on your network and cut the time you spend serving management by 75%. That's it. That's the minimum problem with the minimum basic rates, is people leave them way too low because they're scared about something that might happen and not worried about what is actually happening, right? We have all these other tools. We have all these other things. And like I said, if you have a device that can't connect, worry about that one device if and when it shows up. Don't take this beautiful network you've designed and decide from the very beginning that you're going to, by leaving one specific setting at the lowest data rate, it's just, and the problem is you won't know it. It'll probably still work fine. It'll work well, but it can work better because we can always make it better. So that's my story for you today is, when you design these beautiful networks and you put in these awesome Ruckus APs and you're making everything work, take a second to go into that WLAN setting and change your minimum basic rate from the defaults, bump it up to 24 and see what happens. And yeah, you might have to change it. You might have to drive it down a little bit, but so what? My guess is more than likely you're going to find you don't have to turn it down. Everything's just going to work a little bit better and a little bit faster. Everybody's going to go, wow, you're a genius. Now you just use the tools that are there. So until next time, again, my name's Jim Palmer, and thank you for listening to the RUCKCast. Hey there, thanks for listening. If you like the show and haven't done so, please like and subscribe. If you want to contact the show directly, you can email us at ruckcast@comscope.com. I do read those emails. To learn more about any Ruckus products or services that we've talked about on this or any other prior podcast, please check out our About section of the show or the show notes. And as always, thank you for listening.